My mother cried for weeks when the bank foreclosed on our family home, blaming my father's bad investments. 10 years later, while cleaning her attic, I found the deed to a luxury villa in the Caymans, bought with my college fund the exact month we were evicted. I stood in that sweltering attic, holding the proof that my mother's tears had been the most expensive performance of her life. The deed to a luxury villa wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the receipt for 10 years of my stolen youth. While I was scrubbing floors to pay for a degree I could barely afford, she was secretly presiding over a tropical empire built on the ruins of our family. The woman who claimed my father gambled away our lives had actually been the one holding the deck of cards. My father died in shame and I lived in a shadow, never knowing that the bad investments were actually a one-way ticket to a paradise she kept all to herself. The heavy iron key snapped in the lock of the vanity case, and with it the last 10 years of my life shattered into a million jagged pieces. I wasn't expecting a betrayal while sitting cross-legged on a dusty attic floor, surrounded by the ghosts of a poverty that, as it turns out, was nothing more than a carefully crafted stage play. My hands trembled as I pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope, the kind of paper that feels like old money and hushed conversations. The embossed seal of a law firm in the Cayman Islands stared back at me, mocking the sweat dripping down my neck. I opened it, expecting old tax records or perhaps a forgotten life insurance policy. That I found a deed. It wasn't for the modest apartment we had occupied since the crash, nor for the family home we had lost. It was for Villa Mariposa, a sprawling estate on the white sands of Grand Cayman. The purchase date at the bottom was June 12, 2014. That was the exact Monday the sheriff's deputy stood on our porch and told us we had 4 hours to vacate the only home I had ever loved. The memory of that day came rushing back, as vivid and painful as an open wound. I remember the sound of the mallet, a dull rhythmic thud as the for sale sign was driven into the soft grass of our front lawn. The sky was a mocking, brilliant blue, matching the color of our front door. My mother, Martha, had collapsed onto the bottom step, her face buried in a tattered lace handkerchief that belonged to her grandmother. She looked so small, so utterly defeated. Between heavy, racking sobs, she told me that my father, George, had ruined us. He was a quiet man, a local librarian who spent his evenings reading history books, but she claimed he had a secret fever for the stock market. She told me he had chased a sure thing into the ground, gambling away the equity in our home and the very roof over our heads. I believed her. Every time I looked at my father's portrait after he passed away shortly after the eviction, I felt a mix of love and a burning, silent resentment. I thought he had left us beggars. We spent the next decade living in the shadows of what we used to be. I remember the first winter in our cramped 2-bedroom rental where the heaters hissed but never actually got warm. Martha would sit at the small laminate kitchen table, meticulously clipping coupons while wearing a threadbare coat she'd found at a local church bazaar. "Every penny counts now, Sarah," she'd sigh, her eyes welling with tears as she looked at the price of a gallon of milk. "If only your father had been more careful. If only he had thought about our future instead of those greedy brokers." I felt the weight of that guilt every single day. I felt guilty for wanting new shoes for prom, guilty for the cost of my graduation gown, and especially guilty for the dream I had to abandon. My college fund, the one my grandfather had started the day I was born, had supposedly been the first thing to go in my father's reckless gambling. I didn't go to the state university I had worked so hard to get into. Instead, I spent my 20s working 3 different jobs. I delivered pizzas in the morning, worked a retail desk in the afternoon, and spent my nights cleaning offices just to afford a few credits at the local community college. I saw the toll it took on my body, the dark circles under my eyes that never quite went away, all while my mother played the role of the tragic, struggling widow to perfection. She was the talk of the neighborhood, a woman who had borne her cross with such grace. I worked myself to the bone to make sure she didn't have to suffer, handing over half my meager paychecks to help her keep her head above water. 10 years later, the time had finally come for her to downsize again. She claimed she couldn't afford the upkeep of the rental and was moving into a tiny senior living complex. "It's just my lot in life, dear," she had said, patting my cheek with a hand that felt suspiciously soft for someone who claimed to have spent a decade in the trenches of poverty. I spent my weekend in her stiflingly hot attic, sorting through the remnants of our past. It was a graveyard of broken furniture and boxes labeled with the names of rooms we no longer had. I found my father's old camping gear, the canvas smelling of pine and better days, tucked away in a corner as if she wanted to forget he ever existed. And that's when I saw it, the vanity case. It was hidden behind a stack of old Good Housekeeping magazines, locked tight, as if guarding something more precious than just old trinkets. I searched through a jar of old buttons until I found a small silver key that looked like it might fit. When the lid creaked open, the scent of lavender and expensive stationery filled the dusty air. There were no family heirlooms inside. There were no photographs of my father. There was only the cream-colored envelope and a secondary folder stuffed with wire transfer receipts. My breath hitched as I began to spread them out on the attic floor. These weren't records of bad investments or stock market losses. They were direct transfers from my educational trust. The trust that was supposed to be locked until I turned 18. But there, in black and white, were the signatures. My mother's signature. She hadn't just watched our home go into foreclosure. She had orchestrated the exit. Each receipt was timed perfectly. While she was crying into her handkerchief about the bank taking our house, she was moving hundreds of thousands of dollars into an offshore account in the Caymans. She didn't lose our home. She sold it out from under us to buy a life I wasn't invited to. The bad investments were a ghost story she told to keep me from asking where the money went. She let my father take the blame for her greed, letting him go to his grave with the reputation of a failure while she sat on a secret fortune. I looked at the deed again, Villa Mariposa. It had 5 bedrooms, a private dock, and a staff quarters. A cold, hard anger began to crystallize in my chest, replacing the grief I had carried for a decade. I thought of the nights I had skipped dinner so she could have the last of the chicken. I thought of the 3 jobs I worked until my feet bled, all to protect a woman who was secretly a millionaire. She hadn't been a martyr. She was a thief who stole my education, my home, and my father's dignity. I looked at the vanity case, then back at the trapdoor to the attic. Below me, I could hear her humming a tune as she packed her thrift store dishes, probably already dreaming of the next time she could escape to her villa while I stayed behind to handle the mess. She thought she had buried the truth under 10 years of dust, but the ghost of the foreclosure had finally spoken. I tucked the envelope into my waistband, my mind already spinning. The decade of scarcity was over. Now it was time for the accounting to begin. I tucked the heavy envelope beneath my shirt, the stiff parchment pressing against my skin like a block of ice. Descending the attic stairs, I could hear the rhythmic clink-clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl. My mother was in the kitchen, likely stirring a pot of the watery vegetable soup she insisted on making whenever I visited, a culinary reminder of our impoverished state. I smoothed my hair, wiped the dust from my jeans, and stepped into the light. I had to look normal. I had to be the dutiful, pitying daughter for just a few more hours while the rage inside me boiled like lava beneath a thin crust of ice. Dinner was a masterclass in manipulation. The kitchen light was dim, to save on the electricity bill, as she often reminded me. Martha sat across from me, her shoulders slumped, her eyes fixed on her bowl with a practiced weariness. "The cost of heating this month, Sarah. I just don't know how I'll manage the move," she murmured, her voice thin and wavering. She took a small, theatrical sip of her soup. "If only your father hadn't been so selfish with those investments. I'd be retired in comfort, not counting pennies in a drafty rental." Usually, this was the part where I would reach across the table, squeeze her hand, and offer to cover her utility deposit. Tonight, my hand stayed firmly in my lap, gripping my napkin until my knuckles turned white. I decided to test the waters, my voice coming out more clinical than I intended. "I saw a travel brochure today at the library, Mom. It was for the Cayman Islands. The water looked so turquoise, almost like a dream. Have you ever thought about going somewhere like that? Just to get away?" The reaction was instantaneous. Her hand jerked, and her silver fork hit the rim of the plate with a sharp metallic clack before sliding into the soup. She didn't look up immediately. I watched the side of her neck turn a blotchy, frantic red. When she finally lifted her gaze, the fragile widow mask had slipped, replaced by a wide-eyed, predatory alertness. "Why on earth would you ask that?" she snapped, her voice losing its habitual tremor. "You know we can't afford a bus ticket to the next county, let alone the Caribbean. It's cruel to even bring up such things, Sarah, considering what we've been through." She quickly recovered, dabbing her mouth with a napkin, but the damage was done. That flinch was a confession. The next morning I couldn't sit still. I drove back to our old neighborhood, the one with the blue door house. It felt smaller now, the trees taller and the paint on the fences peeling. I pulled up in front of the house 2 doors down where Mrs. Higgins still lived. She was the neighborhood's unofficial historian, a woman who spent more time behind her lace curtains than in front of her television. She was out front, watering her petunias with a plastic green can, looking exactly as she had a decade ago. "Sarah? Sarah Miller? Is that you, sweetheart?" she called out, her face wrinkling into a genuine smile. We sat on her porch swing, the chain creaking rhythmically. I steered the conversation back to the weeks before the foreclosure, expecting stories of my mother's despair. Instead, Mrs. Higgins leaned in close, the scent of peppermint and old books wafting from her. "You know, Sarah, I always wondered about those months. Your mother told everyone she was devastated, but I'd see her out back on her cell phone, laughing and taking notes in a little leather book. And those men in the suits, they weren't bank men. I remember one of them had a brochure with a palm tree on it. She looked more excited than a girl on prom night during those meetings. I thought maybe she'd won the lottery and was keeping it quiet to avoid the tax man." My heart hammered against my ribs. Martha hadn't been a victim of a sudden bank seizure. She had been a client. She had been shopping for a new life while I was packing my stuffed animals into trash bags. Armed with this new perspective, I returned to my mother's apartment while she was at her weekly seniors bridge club. I felt like a burglar in my own life, but I needed more. I went to her bedroom, a space filled with floral prints and the smell of lavender. I started with the dresser, finding nothing but modest scarves and sensible hosiery. But then I noticed the bottom drawer didn't sit quite right. I pulled it out entirely and discovered a false bottom, a shallow wooden tray hidden beneath the felt lining. Inside was a stack of glossy photographs. I spread them out on her bedspread. There she was. In one photo, she was lounging on a white sand beach, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and oversized designer sunglasses that probably cost more than my first car. In another, she was holding a glass of chilled white wine, smiling at the camera with a vibrancy I hadn't seen since I was a child. There were no thrift store coats here. She was wearing silk tunics and gold jewelry. The background was unmistakable, the lush, tropical gardens of Villa Mariposa. She had been living a double life for 10 years, sneaking away on her trips to visit Aunt June in Florida, only to hop a connecting flight to her private paradise. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, but I needed the technical proof. I met my old high school friend, Leo, who was now a senior paralegal at a firm downtown. We sat in a quiet booth at a nearby diner, the deed and the wire receipts spread between us. Leo's face grew grimmer with every page he turned. "Sarah, this is clean but incredibly dirty," he whispered. "Your college fund was a fiduciary trust. As your legal guardian, she had the power to reinvest the funds if she could prove the current path was failing. By creating a paper trail that made it look like your father had already drained the accounts through bad stock options, she basically gave herself permission to move the remaining funds to protect them. Only she moved them to a shell company, Mariposa Holdings, which she owns. She literally stole your education to buy real estate. Is it legal?" I asked, my voice trembling. "On paper, it looks like a series of unfortunate financial errors and a mother trying to save what was left," Leo said, his eyes filled with pity. "But in reality, it's embezzlement of a minor's trust. She used the foreclosure as a smokescreen. The bank didn't just take the house. She let it happen so she could disappear the rest of the family's assets into the Caribbean." That night, I sat alone in my small, dark apartment. The evidence was strewn across my coffee table. The deed, the secret photos, the legal analysis. I looked at a small framed photo of my father on my desk. He looked so tired in that picture, taken just months before he died. He had spent his final days apologizing for a failure that wasn't his. He had died believing he had let us down, while his wife sat across from him, dreaming of marble floors and ocean breezes funded by his daughter's sweat. I thought of the nights I had worked double shifts at the warehouse, my back aching and my hands raw from cardboard cuts, just so I could send her an extra $200 for her medication. I thought of the community college classes I had to drop because I couldn't afford the textbooks. The grief I had carried for 10 years, the grief for our home, for my father's reputation, for my lost dreams, suddenly shifted. It didn't disappear, it transformed. It became a cold, sharp, and calculated hunger for justice. Martha loved her mask of the suffering martyr, but I was going to tear it off in front of the whole world. I wasn't just going to get my money back. I was going to make sure she felt every bit of the cold, lonely poverty she had forced me to endure. I picked up my phone and began to dial. It was time to invite my mother to a vacation she would never forget. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that grounded me as I prepared to deliver the bait. When my mother finally picked up, her voice was that familiar, practiced rasp of a woman who had spent the morning sighing over bills. "Hello, Sarah. I was just sitting here wondering if I should turn the water heater off during the day to save a few dollars. It's a struggle, dear, it really is." I closed my eyes, the photos of her poolside in the Caymans flashing behind my eyelids. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical sting. "Mom, stop for a second," I said, forcing a cheerful, breathless lift into my tone. "I have some incredible news. My company just awarded me a high-performance bonus. A fully paid luxury retreat to the Caribbean. Grand Cayman specifically. And because you've sacrificed so much for me since the foreclosure, I told them I wanted to bring you as my guest. A week of sunshine, no bills, no worries. What do you think?" There was a silence on the other end so profound I thought the line had gone dead. I could almost feel the gears turning in her head, the frantic collision of panic and greed. For a moment the martyr, in her likely screamed to refuse, to stay hidden in her gray apartment. But the allure of her secret palace was too strong. I heard a soft, shaky intake of breath. "The Caymans? Oh, Sarah, that's so far. And so expensive. But if it's already paid for, I suppose it would be ungrateful to say no. I could use the rest. My heart has been so heavy lately." I hung up the phone with a grim smile. She thought she was going home to her secret. She had no idea she was walking into an audit. The flight was a long exercise in suppressed fury. Martha sat in the plush airplane seat, staring out the window with an expression she probably thought looked like nervous wonder. In reality, she looked like a cat that had finally found the way back to the cream. When our taxi pulled up to the gates of Villa Mariposa, the sun was beginning to dip into the Caribbean Sea, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. The estate was magnificent, white limestone walls, swaying palms, and a private path that led directly to a secluded cove of turquoise water. It was a slap in the face. This was where my college years had gone. This was the interest on my father's reputation. "Goodness, Sarah," Martha whispered, her eyes darting toward the ornate front door. "This is much more than I expected. Are you sure your company didn't make a mistake?" She tried to act timid, but as we stepped onto the cool, white marble of the foyer, her muscle memory took over. She didn't wait for the concierge to show us the way. She walked with a confident stride toward the vaulted living area, her hand trailing along a mahogany banister with an intimate familiarity that made my stomach churn. "It's breathtaking, isn't it?" I asked, watching her from the doorway. We went upstairs to drop our bags. Without a word of direction from me, Martha turned left at the landing, walking straight to the master suite, the one with the panoramic ocean view and the walk-in cedar closet. She gripped the crystal doorknob and pushed it open, her face lighting up with a vanity so bright it finally cracked her poor widow facade. "I'll take this one, dear," she said, her voice suddenly crisp and commanding. "It's better for my joints to be near the balcony air." She didn't realize she had just confessed. A guest doesn't find the master bedroom on the first try in a 10-room villa. I stood in the hallway, the shadow of the doorframe hiding my face, and realized the woman I had spent 10 years trying to save never existed at all. That night I arranged a private dinner on the terrace. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and salt. A single candle flickered between us, casting long, dancing shadows across the table. Martha had changed into a flowing linen dress, one she certainly hadn't bought at a thrift store, and was humming a soft tune as she tucked into a plate of fresh sea bass. She looked younger, her skin glowing under the moonlight, the weight of a decade's worth of lies seemingly evaporated now that she was back in her true element. "You know, Mom," I said, setting my wine glass down with a deliberate clink. "I kept thinking about what you said. About how Dad ruined us. How he was so reckless with the investments." She sighed, a practiced, mournful sound. "Let's not talk about that now, Sarah. We're in paradise. Let's just enjoy what we have left." "But that's the thing," I replied, reaching into my bag. "We have quite a lot left, don't we?" I slid the heavy cream envelope across the table. Beside it, I fanned out the wire transfer receipts, the ones with her elegant looping signature clearly visible under the candlelight. "I found these in the attic," tucked inside your lavender vanity case. Imagine my surprise when I realized that Villa Mariposa wasn't a corporate retreat. It's yours. Bought with the money that was supposed to put me through school. Bought while the sheriff was putting a lock on our blue door. The color drained from her face so fast it was like a curtain falling. She looked at the papers, then at me, her mouth working but no sound coming out. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below filled the silence, a rhythmic, punishing sound. Sarah, you don't understand, she finally stammered, her voice low and desperate. I was terrified. Your father, he didn't know how to manage things. I had to secure our future. I was getting older. I couldn't face being nobody. You made me a nobody. I finally snapped, though I didn't raise my voice. The quiet intensity was more terrifying. You let me work 3 jobs. You let me apologize for a father who did nothing wrong. You sat there and watched me cry over a degree I couldn't afford while you were picking out marble tile for this terrace. Was the view worth it, Mother? Was it worth watching your daughter break her back so you could have a secret pool? She didn't cry. Not real tears. She tried to reach for my hand, her eyes shifting back into that martyr squint. It's for you eventually, Sarah. It's all for you in the will. The will doesn't matter because you're signing it over tonight, I said, pulling a final document from my bag. A legal quitclaim deed prepared by Leo. I leaned forward, the candlelight reflecting in my eyes. Here is the choice I'm giving you. It's the same one you gave Dad and me, only I'm being more honest. You sign this villa over to me tonight. I will sell it, pay off every debt I have, and use the rest to set up a trust in Dad's name to help kids who've lost their homes. If you sign, I let you go back to your senior apartment and I never speak to you again. If you don't, these papers and the recordings I've made of our vacation so far go straight to the fraud division of the IRS and the Cayman authorities. You can have the villa, Mother, but you'll be watching the sunset through a prison bars. Her hand shook as she took the pen. She looked at the villa, her paradise, one last time, realizing that her greed had finally hit a wall she couldn't charm her way past. She signed the papers in a jagged, ugly scrawl. The mask was gone. There was no more Saint Martha. There was only a lonely, caught thief. I flew back the next morning, leaving her to find her own way home. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal filings and real estate closings. When the sale of Villa Mariposa finalized, the check was enough to change my life, but I didn't buy a mansion. I paid off my loans, bought a small, sturdy cottage by the woods, and most importantly, I cleared the air. I took out a full-page notice in the local paper of our old town, a public correction of the record regarding my father's estate. The final thing I did was visit the cemetery. I had replaced the old, weathered stone with a beautiful, tall slab of granite. It read, George Miller, a man of honor and integrity. I sat by his grave for a long time, telling him the truth, feeling the weight of 10 years of resentment finally dissolve into the soil. My mother lives in that modest senior apartment now. No one visits her. The neighbors don't hear stories about her sacrifices anymore because I took the photos and the documents to the bridge club before I left. She is finally living the life she once pretended to have. Only this time, there is no secret villa waiting for her at the end of a flight. As for me, I walk through my small house, run my hand over the wooden kitchen table I bought with my own honest earnings, and I smile. The blue door is gone, but for the first time in a decade, when I close my eyes at night, the only thing I hear is the truth. And it is the sweetest sound in the world.